Silence doesn't mean surrender, it means strategy. This truth separates those who understand the sophisticated dynamics of power from those who mistake noise for strength, reaction for authority, and constant engagement for effectiveness. The world has been conditioned to interpret silence as weakness, withdrawal as defeat, and strategic non-response as inability to respond. This conditioning serves those who benefit from keeping others trapped in reactive patterns. I have wielded silence as a weapon more devastating than any argument, deployed strategic non-response more effectively than any retaliation, and achieved victories through calculated withdrawal that direct confrontation could never have secured. In the theater of human interaction, silence is not the absence of power, but power in its most concentrated and unpredictable form. The untrained mind equates silence with passivity, assuming that those who remain quiet lack the capacity or courage to engage. But this assumption reveals fundamental misunderstanding of how influence actually operates. The most sophisticated forms of power work through restraint rather than expression, through what is withheld rather than what is revealed, through the strategic creation of uncertainty rather than the provision of clarity. Today, I speak of silence as one of the most potent tools available to those who understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Not because you cannot act, but because strategic inaction serves your objectives more effectively than any action could. The world has been systematically trained to misread silence, interpreting strategic non-response as evidence of weakness, confusion, or defeat. This misinterpretation serves the interests of those who rely on provoking reactions to maintain their sense of power and control. When you understand that most people will incorrectly interpret your silence, you gain access to a form of misdirection that allows you to operate while others fundamentally misunderstand your position and capabilities. Research in behavioral psychology confirms that silence creates psychological discomfort in most people, triggering anxiety and uncertainty that often leads to poor decision-making and self-revealing behavior. When you remain strategically silent, others frequently fill that silence with their own assumptions, projections, and fears, providing you with invaluable intelligence about their motivations, insecurities, and intended strategies, while revealing nothing about your own. This dynamic is particularly powerful in conflict situations where opponents expect immediate defensive responses to their provocations. When you fail to provide the expected reaction, you disrupt their psychological strategy and force them to operate without the feedback they need to calibrate their approach. They must continue their attacks without knowing whether they are effective, often escalating to increasingly obvious and self-damaging levels of aggression. The misinterpretation extends to observers, who may conclude that your silence indicates agreement with accusations, acceptance of unfavorable terms, or inability to defend your position. While this misunderstanding may seem disadvantageous, it actually provides strategic benefits by causing others to underestimate your capabilities and intentions. When people believe you are weaker than you actually are, they often make tactical errors that create opportunities you wouldn't have had if they understood your true strength. Strategic silence also protects you from the trap of premature revelation. In many situations, speaking too soon or too much provides adversaries with information they can use against you. Your silence preserves your options while forcing others to act based on incomplete information about your position, resources, and intentions. This informational asymmetry becomes a significant advantage in any form of negotiation or conflict. Perhaps most importantly, the widespread misinterpretation of silence means that when you do choose to speak or act, the impact is dramatically amplified. After extended periods of strategic silence, your eventual words or actions carry weight and surprise value that would be impossible to achieve through constant engagement. The contrast between silence and selective expression makes your chosen communications far more memorable and influential. Strategic silence operates on several psychological principles that make it one of the most potent tools for maintaining and exercising power in human relationships. Understanding these mechanisms allows you to deploy silence, not as passive withdrawal, but as active strategy that shapes others' behavior and perceptions in ways that serve your objectives. The first principle is uncertainty creation. Humans have a fundamental need to predict and understand others' responses, and silence disrupts this predictive capacity. When you remain strategically quiet, Others cannot assess your emotional state, gauge your intentions, or anticipate your next moves. This uncertainty creates psychological pressure that often leads them to make concessions or reveal information in attempts to elicit responses that would restore their sense of control over the interaction. The second principle involves what psychologists call projection dynamics. When faced with silence, people tend to fill the void with their own fears, assumptions, and internal conflicts. Your strategic non-response becomes a blank screen onto which others project their insecurities, often revealing far more about themselves than they intended. This psychological mechanism provides you with valuable intelligence while maintaining complete control over what you reveal about yourself. The third principle is attention and status dynamics. In most social situations, the person who speaks least while maintaining presence often commands the most attention and respect. Strategic silence communicates confidence and self-sufficiency that constant talking undermines. Others begin to value your eventual words more highly because they are rare, and they often interpret your restraint as evidence of depth and wisdom that more talkative individuals lack. Research confirms that strategic silence can induce what behavioral scientists call reciprocal disclosure pressure. When one party maintains silence while others speak, those others often feel compelled to share more information than they originally intended, attempting to balance what feels like an unequal exchange. This pressure can lead opponents to reveal strategies, negotiating positions, or vulnerabilities they would never have disclosed if you had engaged in typical back-and-forth communication. The psychology of strategic silence also leverages what negotiation experts recognize as patience as power. Those who can remain comfortable with silence demonstrate emotional regulation and long-term thinking that often intimidate others into making concessions simply to resolve the discomfort that silence creates. Your ability to remain quiet while others fidget, explain, or justify communicates a form of strength that verbal sparring cannot achieve. Most sophisticated is how strategic silence creates what might be called interpretive control. When you don't explain your motivations, clarify your position, or respond to accusations, others must guess at your reasoning. This guesswork often leads them to attribute more sophisticated motives to your actions than may actually exist, enhancing your reputation for strategic thinking while requiring no effort on your part to cultivate that reputation. Mastering strategic silence requires developing the discipline to resist natural human impulses to explain, defend, justify, or engage when others attempt to draw you into reactive patterns. This discipline involves both external restraint and internal composure, the ability to remain genuinely calm and focused while others escalate their attempts to provoke responses. The art begins with recognizing situations where silence serves your interests better than engagement. These typically include moments when others are attempting to manipulate you through emotional provocation, when they are fishing for information you prefer to keep private, when they are trying to draw you into conflicts that serve their objectives rather than yours, or when immediate response would be based on incomplete information or emotional reaction rather than strategic consideration. Calculated non-engagement requires developing comfort with others' discomfort. Most people find silence psychologically uncomfortable and will increase their efforts to elicit responses when their initial attempts fail. Your ability to remain serene while others become increasingly agitated demonstrates a form of emotional strength that often causes them to question their own tactics and assumptions about the interaction. The timing of strategic silence becomes crucial for maximum effectiveness. Deployed too early in relationships or negotiations, silence may be interpreted as disinterest or inability to engage. Used too late, it may seem like withdrawal after defeat. The most effective strategic silence is employed when others expect engagement, creating maximum contrast between their expectations and your actual response. The art also involves selective breaking of silence for maximum impact. When you do choose to speak after extended strategic silence, your words carry exponentially more weight than they would in normal conversation. This selective engagement allows you to control the rhythm and focus of interactions, directing attention toward topics you choose while avoiding areas where engagement would not serve your interests. Perhaps most sophisticated is learning to use strategic silence as active communication, rather than mere absence of communication. Your silence can convey disapproval more powerfully than criticism, confidence more effectively than boasting, and strength more convincingly than threats. The meaning others derive from your silence often serves your purposes better than anything you might have said explicitly. The discipline extends to maintaining strategic silence consistently across different contexts and relationships. If you deploy silence strategically in some situations but react immediately in others, people learn to escalate their provocations until they reach levels that trigger your responses. Consistency in your strategic non-engagement trains others to expect less reactivity from you, often leading them to modify their approach entirely, rather than continuing futile attempts to provoke reactions. In any form of conflict or negotiation, information represents power, and strategic silence becomes a sophisticated tool for managing the flow of intelligence between parties, while others reveal their positions, strategies, and vulnerabilities through their words and reactions. Your silence preserves your advantages while gathering intelligence that can be used strategically when you choose to act. The information warfare aspect of strategic silence operates through what intelligence professionals call elicitation without reciprocation. When you remain quiet while others speak, you gather valuable data about their motivations, fears, pressure points, and decision-making processes without providing similar intelligence about yourself. This creates significant asymmetric advantage in any competitive situation. Your silence often prompts others to fill conversational voids with information they would never have volunteered if you had been actively participating in typical dialogue. They may reveal sensitive details about their situations, admit to weaknesses they intended to hide, or disclose strategies they hope to keep secret, all in attempts to generate responses from you that never come. Strategic silence also prevents you from making statements that could be used against you later. In legal, professional, or personal conflicts, words spoken in emotional moments often become weapons in opponents' hands. Your consistent refusal to engage in verbal sparring eliminates opportunities for others to gather ammunition for future use, while forcing them to develop their arguments without knowing your counterpositions. The intelligence-gathering power of silence is amplified in group settings, where your non-participation often causes others to reveal alliance structures, hidden agendas, and internal conflicts they would normally keep concealed. When you remain strategically quiet during group discussions, conflicts, or negotiations, participants often forget your presence and reveal information about their true relationships and motivations. Perhaps most valuable is how strategic silence allows you to observe behavioral patterns and decision-making processes that active participation would obscure. When you're not engaged in the immediate dynamics of conversation or conflict, you can analyze others' communication styles, identify their psychological triggers, and recognize their strategic patterns, information that becomes invaluable for future interactions. The warfare aspect extends to timing and positioning. Your silence denies others the ability to predict when and how you might enter disputes or negotiations. They cannot prepare responses to arguments you haven't made, or defenses against strategies you haven't revealed. When you do eventually engage, you often catch them unprepared because they couldn't anticipate positions they had no intelligence about. The most challenging aspect of wielding silence strategically is developing the internal discipline to maintain restraint when every instinct urges immediate response. This discipline requires overcoming social conditioning, emotional impulses, and ego drives that typically compel people to engage whenever they feel challenged, misunderstood, or provoked. The discipline begins with accepting that most provocations are designed to generate reactions, rather than achieve genuine communication or resolution. When you recognize that others' words or actions are primarily intended to trigger responses that serve their psychological or strategic needs, you can evaluate whether providing those responses serves your interests or merely feeds their objectives. Developing this restraint involves cultivating what might be called emotional sovereignty, the capacity to remain internally calm and centered regardless of external pressures or provocations. This involves both psychological techniques for managing emotional reactions and philosophical frameworks that prioritize long-term strategic objectives over short-term emotional satisfaction. The discipline extends to resisting social pressure to explain, justify, or defend your silence when others demand engagement. Many people will interpret your strategic restraint as rudeness, weakness, or passive aggression. and they may escalate their efforts to force responses through increasingly dramatic accusations or provocations. Maintaining your strategic silence despite this pressure requires strong commitment to your objectives and clear understanding of why engagement would compromise those objectives. Perhaps most challenging is maintaining strategic restraint. When others attempt to force engagement through emotional manipulation, moral pressure, or social obligations, they may claim that your silence is hurting them, damaging relationships, or preventing resolution of important issues. The discipline requires distinguishing between situations where engagement genuinely serves legitimate needs and situations where demands for response primarily serve others' need to feel in control of interactions. The mastery involves learning to find satisfaction and strength in restraint itself, rather than in the reactions that engagement might provide. This requires reframing silence from passive non-action to active strategy, from withdrawal to positioning, from weakness to sophisticated power deployment that serves objectives more effectively than reactive engagement could achieve. The path I walked required mastering silence, not as retreat but as advanced positioning, not as weakness but as strength. So confident it needs no demonstration, not as surrender but as strategy, so sophisticated that others mistake it for absence of capability, until results reveal the true nature of what they were witnessing. I learned that in a world full of noise, silence commands attention. In environments dominated by reactive patterns, strategic restraint demonstrates superior emotional regulation. In conflicts where others exhaust themselves through constant engagement, those who choose their moments of action carefully maintain resources for when engagement serves their objectives, rather than others' need for drama. The most profound discovery was that silence is not empty space waiting to be filled, but complete presence that needs no supplement. When you master strategic silence, you discover that much of what passes for communication is merely psychological noise designed to manage others' anxiety, rather than convey meaningful information or achieve practical objectives. Your modern world has amplified both the pressure to respond immediately to every stimulus and the power available to those who resist this pressure. Social media creates expectations of constant engagement and immediate responses, while the same platforms provide opportunities for those strategic enough to use selective silence as a tool for building intrigue, maintaining control, and demonstrating the kind of discipline that separates leaders from followers. Remember that your attention, your responses, and your engagement are valuable resources that should be invested strategically rather than spent reactively. Every moment you spend responding to provocations designed to generate reactions is a moment not available for advancing your authentic objectives. Every word spoken to satisfy others' need for engagement is a word that could have been saved for moments when speaking serves your purposes rather than theirs. The discipline of strategic silence ultimately teaches you that power lies not in your ability to respond to everything, but in your wisdom about what deserves response. Not every challenge requires acknowledgement. Not every provocation merits engagement. Not every invitation to conflict serves your interests. The strongest response is sometimes no response. The most powerful action is sometimes inaction. The most strategic communication is sometimes silence. When others mistake your silence for surrender, let them maintain that illusion, while you maintain your advantage. When they interpret your restraint as weakness, allow that misunderstanding to serve your positioning. When they assume your strategic non-engagement indicates inability to engage, let that assumption guide their decisions while you operate from superior understanding of when engagement serves your purposes. Silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. In mastering this principle, you join the ranks of those who understand that the most sophisticated forms of power work through restraint, that the most effective influence often operates through what is withheld, rather than what is expressed, and that victory sometimes requires the patience to allow others to defeat themselves while you remain strategically positioned for optimal outcomes. Your silence becomes your shield against manipulation, your sword against those who seek to provoke reactions for their benefit, and your strategic advantage in any situation where others exhaust themselves seeking responses you choose not to provide. In learning when not to respond, you master one of the most sophisticated tools available for maintaining control, gathering intelligence, and achieving objectives that reactive engagement could never secure. Master the art of strategic silence, and discover that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Not because you lack the capacity to act, but because you possess the wisdom to recognize when action serves others' purposes rather than your own, and the discipline to wait for moments when your engagement serves objectives worthy of your most valuable resources.